For centuries, Polish nobles claimed descent from ancient Sarmatian warriors. The myth said they came from Iranian steppe tribes, not local Slavs. Modern DNA reveals Poland is over 55% R1a-Z282, a Slavic marker. But rare steppe haplogroups like R1a-Z93 also appear. These traces are mostly found in noble lineages. Burials with steppe-style weapons support the legend. Gene flow happened via trade, war, and elite marriages. Some warriors from the East became Polish ancestors. Science confirms the myth wasn't entirely fantasy. Myth and DNA align more than we thought. Welcome to the channel. Let's dive in. Part 1. The Legend of Sarmatism. For centuries, the Polish nobility insisted they were not like the rest of the population and claimed descent from an ancient warrior people known as the Sarmatians. These weren't vague cultural ties but direct bloodline claims tied to power, identity, and rule. The term Sarmatism emerged during the Polish Renaissance and blossomed during the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a defining myth of noble origin. Nobles believed their ancestors rode from the distant Iranian steppes into Eastern Europe, conquering the land and establishing a warrior elite that later became the ruling class of Poland. This belief shaped how nobles dressed in Oriental-inspired garb, how they rode into battle with sabers and wings, and how they distinguished themselves from the peasantry. Paintings from the 16th and 17th centuries show grand portraits of winged hussars and noblemen styled after imagined Sarmatian warriors. Court poets wrote about the Sarmatian soul, fierce independence, and honor above all. The term was printed on official seals, carved into gravestones, and echoed in public declarations. The idea took firm root in the political ideology of the szlachta, the noble class that dominated the Sejm, Poland's parliament. They portrayed themselves as the final defenders of liberty in a world of tyrants, comparing their nation to ancient Rome and themselves to an aristocratic republic of warriors. But this story wasn't just poetic fantasy. It was deeply strategic. Poland was not a homogeneous land. It was a vast multi-ethnic union of Poles, Lithuanians, Ruthenians, and more. The ruling class needed a glue to hold it all together. The Sarmatian myth offered that identity, a shared, glorious past that elevated the szlachta above common origins. But historians long questioned its validity. Could a Central European elite truly descend from Iranian-speaking steppe riders? Ancient Roman geographers described Sarmatia as a region stretching from the Vistula to the Volga. They described the Sarmatians as horseback archers, nomadic and fierce, fighting in decorated armor and migrating with herds. However, they made no link to the Polish people. The idea that these warriors founded the Polish nation appeared centuries later, conveniently aligning with noble interests. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, many viewed the myth as self-serving. It explained away inequality and justified a caste-like system in which nobles had nearly exclusive control over politics and land. But the myth endured. Even after the partitions of Poland erased the country from the map, Polish exiles and thinkers clung to the Sarmatian identity as a symbol of resilience and pride. Yet, with no archaeological or linguistic proof, many modern scholars dismissed the story as noble propaganda. That changed when genetic tools entered the debate. In recent years, ancient DNA studies have begun to uncover the ancestry of Iron Age populations across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. These studies can identify genetic markers shared between ancient remains and living people. One such marker is haplogroup R1a, especially prevalent in Eastern Europe. R1a is sometimes called the Slavic marker, due to its high frequency among Slavic populations. It was used to reinforce the mainstream idea that Poles are genetically Slavic, closely related to Ukrainians, Russians, and other Eastern Europeans. But when researchers analyzed ancient Sarmatian remains from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a twist emerged. Some of these warriors also carried R1a, specifically subclades like R1a-Z93, which are more common in Central and South Asia today. Meanwhile, modern Poles tend to carry R1a-Z282, a different branch. This suggested that the Sarmatians and the Slavs shared a broader ancestral origin but diverged over time. The story became more nuanced. The Sarmatians were likely an Ironic people, both linguistically and culturally, but genetically they shared distant roots with Proto-Slavic groups. As the steppes churned with waves of migration and conflict, these populations interacted. By the time Slavic tribes expanded across Europe in the early medieval period, some mixing had already occurred. Experts suggest that the Polish elite may have absorbed genetic input from steppe populations, including groups culturally related to the Sarmatians. According to recent papers published in population genetics journals, Iron Age samples from southern Poland showed some overlap with steppe populations, though not enough to confirm a direct Sarmatian founding myth. What this means is that the nobility's claim may not have been entirely invented. It was exaggerated, stylized, and politicized, but possibly rooted in older patterns of gene flow across Eurasia. The nobility, aware of their unique customs and traditions, may have preserved a cultural memory of distant contact with steppe groups. That cultural memory eventually became a myth, a legend used to define identity. So while the story of pure Sarmatian descent may not be genetically provable, neither is it entirely baseless. Cultural identity is often a fusion of myth and memory, history and imagination. And in this case, the Sarmatian myth helped shape Polish politics, fashion, and worldview for centuries. The real question isn't whether every Polish nobleman had steppe DNA, but why that idea held such power for so long. As we move forward in this documentary, we'll explore the Slavic core of Polish origins, examine how haplogroup R1a spread across Europe, and reveal the surprising overlaps that science has found between history and DNA. Stay tuned as we unpack the genetic puzzle hidden beneath the armor of Poland's noble past. Welcome to a journey of discovery, identity, and the secrets carried in our blood. Part 2. Slavic DNA and the Sarmatian conflict. For over a century, scientists have tried to untangle Poland's origin story using genetics and archaeology to define who the Polish people truly are. The dominant view states that Poland is the heartland of the Slavic world, a nation built by Slavic tribes who migrated westward and northward from the forest steppe zone of Eastern Europe. This theory rests on both historical accounts and the widespread presence of a genetic marker known as haplogroup R1a, which is common among Slavic-speaking populations. According to peer-reviewed genetic studies, over 55% of Polish males carry this haplogroup, making it one of the strongest signals of shared ancestry in Europe. Similar frequencies are found in Western Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Slovakia. This consistency gave rise to the idea that modern Poles are overwhelmingly Slavic in their genetic makeup. But this mainstream narrative created a direct contradiction with the older noble myth of Sarmatian ancestry, which claimed descent from Iranian-speaking warrior tribes. The Sarmatians, according to ancient Greek and Roman texts, were not Slavs. They spoke an Ironic language and were culturally closer to the Scythians, who dominated the steppes of Central Asia and southern Ukraine during the first millennium BCE. For years, these two ideas, Slavic identity and Sarmatian nobility, stood in opposition, each promoted by different sources. Linguists and historians emphasized Slavic origins, while cultural nationalists defended the noble class's distinct heritage. It was assumed that only one story could be true. Either Poland was founded by Slavic tribes expanding westward after the fall of the Roman Empire, or it was built atop an earlier elite of steppe horsemen who left behind a genetic legacy in the upper classes. But when ancient DNA entered the conversation, things became more complicated. Researchers began extracting and sequencing DNA from Iron Age skeletons found in burial mounds associated with Sarmatian and other steppe cultures. Many of these sites were located in modern-day Ukraine, southern Russia, and even parts of Hungary. The genetic profiles of these ancient individuals showed a mix of haplogroups, including both R1a and others like J2 and G2. What surprised many was that the Sarmatians did not exclusively carry R1a-Z93, the steppe-associated subclade more common in Asia. Some samples revealed haplogroup variants now dominant in Eastern Europe, blurring the lines between steppe and Slavic ancestries. This forced scientists to re-evaluate the idea that these were two completely separate populations. It also raised the possibility that Slavic populations and steppe groups like the Sarmatians had interacted, mixed, and influenced one another over centuries of migration and warfare. Experts suggest that by the late Iron Age, parts of Central and Eastern Europe were already genetic melting pots where Iranic-speaking groups and early Slavic communities intermingled. This wasn't a one-time invasion or mass replacement. It was a long process of gradual cultural and biological exchange. In Poland, especially along the Vistula River and in the Carpathian Basin, archaeological evidence indicates repeated contacts between local tribes and steppe cultures. Some burial practices, such as Kurgan-style mounds and horse sacrifices, align with steppe traditions rather than Central European customs. These findings support the idea that Polish lands were not isolated from broader steppe dynamics. They were part of a contact zone where ideas, genes, and traditions moved freely. When the first Slavic tribes began organizing into proto-states in the early medieval period, they may have inherited more than just land from previous cultures. They may have absorbed elite lineages with steppe ancestry. This could help explain why Poland's noble class later emphasized their distinction from the peasantry, claiming descent from warrior elites of the East. While this may not prove that every nobleman was a Sarmatian by blood, it does suggest that at least some elite families carried steppe genetic signatures. A recent study by European genome researchers identified traces of East Eurasian ancestry in certain Polish noble lineages, including markers consistent with steppe nomads. Though the percentages are small, they are statistically significant and distinguishable from the broader Slavic population. This subtle distinction may have been amplified over centuries by endogamous marriage practices among the nobility, further reinforcing a sense of separateness. Meanwhile, the general Polish population retained the dominant Slavic genetic signature. In essence, both stories may hold elements of truth. Poland is predominantly Slavic in language, culture, and genetics. But within that Slavic framework, a small but real steppe imprint exists, more visible in elite lineages and regions that served as ancient crossroads of migration. The Sarmatian myth, then, was not pure fantasy but a stylized memory of real historical mixing. And it's here that the neighboring nation strategy begins to emerge. Unlike national myths that focus inward, Sarmatism looked outward to external ancestors, distinguishing the elite from the common people. It was a political tool as much as a historical claim, designed to reinforce hierarchy and justify noble privilege. But today, science is peeling away the layers of myth and revealing how interconnected these ancestral stories really are. The story of Polish origins is no longer a binary between Slavic and Sarmatian, but a layered narrative of migration, assimilation, and adaptation. In the next chapter, we'll explore how these findings fit into the wider genetic landscape of Eastern Europe and what they tell us about the migrations that shaped the continent. Stay with us as we decode the past written in our blood. Part 3: Steppe Shadows in Polish Soil. As researchers continued to probe deeper into Poland's ancient DNA layers, they began uncovering patterns buried beneath centuries of cultural evolution and geopolitical change. These weren't simple lineages or isolated genetic signals. They were mosaics that revealed the echoes of forgotten populations moving across the continent in waves. Among the most significant discoveries was the presence of Eastern steppe ancestry in Iron Age and early medieval burial sites scattered throughout southern Poland, especially near the Carpathian Mountains and along trade corridors such as the Amber Road. These corridors were ancient superhighways, linking the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, used by merchants, migrants, and warriors for thousands of years. The people who traveled them did more than trade. They settled, intermarried, and brought with them traces of their ancestry that can still be detected today. Geneticists, working with archaeological teams, sequenced DNA from skeletal remains buried in warrior graves. Individuals interred with horse gear, curved sabers, and steppe-style ornaments. Many carried haplogroup R1a subclades, but crucially, some of these subclades matched those found in ancient Sarmatian and Alan burials from the Pontic steppe. Experts suggest this points to limited but significant gene flow from Iranic-speaking steppe nomads into local populations in present-day Poland between 200 BCE and 400 CE. These early intrusions didn't result in mass conquest or displacement, but created a hybrid culture in which Eastern and Central European traditions coexisted. Burial mounds with both Slavic pottery and Sarmatian weaponry have been found, suggesting overlapping social structures. This hybridization complicates the national origin story, revealing that Polish identity, even in its earliest phase, was never biologically pure or culturally isolated. Instead, it evolved through continual engagement with surrounding groups, including so-called neighboring nations of antiquity that moved across the steppes. The DNA tells a similar story. Poles are genetically closer to Western Slavs, yet they show more steppe ancestry than Czechs or Slovenians. This elevated steppe signal is subtle but meaningful, with estimates suggesting that up to 10% of Polish autosomal DNA comes from steppe origin populations, significantly higher than in Western Europe. While this doesn't confirm Sarmatian ancestry on a national scale, it supports the idea that a fraction of the population, likely concentrated among elites and borderland communities, retained steppe genetic input for generations. This may explain why noble families passed down oral histories of foreign origin and styled themselves as Eastern warriors. As one historian noted, the Polish nobility did not adopt Sarmatian identity out of coincidence. It was likely rooted in inherited traditions, reinforced by physical traits, martial customs, and perhaps even distant memories of migration. But beyond identity, this mixture had political consequences. Sarmatism encouraged nobles to resist Western European influence, especially during the height of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It promoted values like honor, cavalry warfare, rural independence, and distrust of foreign monarchies. These traits mirrored those attributed to Sarmatian ancestors, nomadic warriors loyal only to clan and tradition. The myth therefore shaped not only self-image but statecraft. Even when the Commonwealth crumbled under the pressure of partition, Polish poets and patriots still invoked the image of the Sarmatian knight as a symbol of freedom and resistance. Today, this symbolism remains in Polish literature, historical dramas, and national memory. But science is reshaping that memory. With the growth of direct-to-consumer DNA testing, thousands of Poles have begun to trace their haplogroups, searching for proof of their ancient origins. Those who carry R1a-Z282 are often told they belong to the Slavic lineage, while rarer results like R1a-Z93 or Q1b might point to steppe nomads or even Central Asian ancestry. These discoveries can be thrilling, confusing, or even unsettling. Yet they serve one purpose: to connect people to the long and tangled roots of their genetic past. It's no longer about proving superiority or noble blood. It's about understanding the many layers that form modern identity. And in Poland's case, those layers include both forest and steppe, both Slavic and Sarmatian. According to comparative analyses by European genome labs, modern Polish populations form a distinct cluster on the PCA genetic chart, close to West Slavs, yet shifted slightly toward Eastern steppe components when compared to populations like Czechs and Austrians. This may reflect the impact of repeated steppe contact over centuries, from the early Sarmatians to later waves like the Avars and Hungarians. All of these groups left traces, even if only a few %. These traces are part of the living genome and echo the complexity of human migration. In the next episode, we'll examine the specific subclades of R1a that help distinguish Slavic populations from their steppe cousins and explore how regional diversity within Poland mirrors this ancient entanglement. Stay with us as we move closer to the genetic core of the neighboring nation strategy that shaped Polish origins. Part 4. Decoding haplogroups and subclades. As the mystery of Polish origins deepens, the key to resolving the Sarmatian myth lies not just in broad genetic categories like R1a, but in their detailed branches known as subclades. Haplogroup R1a is not exclusive to any one population. It stretches from Scandinavia to India and from Siberia to the Balkans. What separates different historical lineages are the subclades, distinct mutations that act like time-stamped signatures of ancient migration. Among modern Poles, the dominant subclade is R1a-Z282, which is strongly associated with Balto-Slavic speakers and concentrated in Central and Eastern Europe. This branch likely expanded from the forest steppe zone north of the Black Sea around 2500 BCE, carried by Proto-Slavic tribes into what is now Poland, Belarus, and Western Russia. This genetic expansion aligns with archaeological cultures like the Trzciniec and Larsson, which showed clear signs of continuity in settlement, pottery, and burial practices. Meanwhile, the Sarmatians, who roamed from the Caspian Sea to the Danube, carried a different branch, predominantly R1a-Z93, along with other haplogroups like J2 and G2. R1a-Z93 is more common today in Central Asia, Iran, and the Indian subcontinent, and its presence in ancient Sarmatian graves suggests a different point of origin rooted in the east of the Pontic steppe. The divergence between Z282 and Z93 occurred roughly 5,000 years ago, meaning both subclades share a common ancestor but took very different routes. This explains how both modern Poles and ancient Sarmatians could carry R1a yet represent culturally and historically distinct lineages. Geneticists use this information to trace ancient population movements with increasing accuracy. According to population studies published by European bioinformatics labs, less than 2% of modern Poles carry R1a-Z93, making it a rare but traceable marker. Its presence is often localized and more likely to appear in noble families who claim descent from steppe ancestors. This genetic rarity supports the idea of limited but meaningful Sarmatian input into the Polish gene pool, particularly among elite lineages. In contrast, the general population overwhelmingly reflects the R1a-Z282 lineage, which aligns with mainstream Slavic expansion models. Researchers also identified another interesting pattern. Subclades like R1a-M458 and its downstream branches are especially common in Poland and virtually absent in Iranic-speaking populations. This confirms that while R1a is a shared ancient root, these downstream branches form the genetic backbone of modern Slavic groups. In this context, the Polish origin story becomes a blend of dominant Slavic continuity with subtle steppe echoes preserved in specific regions and lineages. DNA testing companies now offer tools that allow individuals to explore these subclades in detail, often revealing surprising connections. For example, a Polish man with R1a-Z93 might find closer genetic matches in northern Iran or Tajikistan than in neighboring Slavic countries. This doesn't make him less Polish, it makes his ancestry more diverse. As more people test and publish results, genetic maps of Poland are becoming richer and more complex, revealing micro-regional differences that challenge the idea of national homogeneity. In some eastern regions of Poland, closer to the Ukrainian border, there is a slightly higher occurrence of haplogroups associated with steppe and Caucasian populations. This may reflect deeper historical interactions, such as trade routes, invasions, or intermarriage with neighboring tribes and confederations like the Alans or Scythians. In contrast, Western Poland aligns more closely with Germanic and West Slavic genetic patterns, showing how even within one country, history left distinct fingerprints. The neighboring nation strategy now begins to look like a layered adaptation rather than a fabricated myth. Noble families, in asserting Sarmatian origin, may have preserved real genealogical memory, perhaps not as full-blooded descendants but as lineages touched by steppe contact during a turbulent Iron Age. Some experts argue that the myth itself may have originated from observed physical or cultural differences between noble and common populations, differences later mythologized into tales of Eastern warriors. Historical documents show that even in the 16th century, Polish nobles debated their foreign-looking attire, with some embracing it as proof of ancient origins while others criticized it as unpatriotic. This cultural tension mirrored an older biological story slowly coming to light through haplogroups and subclades. While science cannot confirm noble titles or validate legends, it can point to statistically significant anomalies. Genes that traveled further, mixed differently, and embedded themselves in surprising places. Today, understanding these patterns helps demystify the narrative of Polish uniqueness without undermining national pride. It places Poland within a broader network of Eurasian migrations, where ideas, bloodlines, and symbols crossed borders long before modern states existed. In the next part of our series, we'll turn to the archaeological evidence, how grave goods, burial customs, and settlement patterns support or contradict the genetic findings. Through these lenses, we'll explore how myths become material and how material evidence reveals truth hidden beneath the legend. Join us as we continue decoding the neighboring nation strategy through layers of soil, bone, and story. Part 5. Burial clues and warrior graves. As genetic data began to shape the modern understanding of Polish origins, archaeologists turned their attention to the material remains left behind by ancient peoples who once moved across the region now known as Poland. From the sandy plains of Mazovia to the hills of Lesser Poland, thousands of burial sites have been excavated over the past century, offering a timeline of cultural transitions that span from the Bronze Age to the early medieval period. Among these, a specific category of graves has drawn particular interest, those linked to warrior elites, often accompanied by horse burials, curved sabers, ornate belt fittings, and other artifacts resembling steppe traditions. Some of these graves were originally thought to belong solely to early Slavic or Germanic tribes, but with advances in radiocarbon dating and artifact analysis, many have now been reclassified as signs of interaction between local populations and Eastern nomadic groups. The discovery of Sarmatian-style grave goods in what is today southeastern Poland, particularly in the Subcarpathian region, has triggered new debates among historians. These items, decorated scabbards, iron arrowheads, silver mounts, and composite bows, mirror those found in confirmed Sarmatian and Alan sites along the lower Volga and Don rivers. But it is not just the artifacts that raise questions. It is the burial styles themselves. Steppe nomads practiced kurgan-style mound burials, often with the deceased laid on their back, facing east, surrounded by grave goods and animal offerings. While kurgans are rare in Poland, similar features have appeared in select elite graves from the Iron Age and early Roman period. These hybrid burials appear to blend steppe ritual with local customs, suggesting either cultural adoption or the presence of actual individuals from steppe tribes integrated into local society. This matches the genetic findings from the same period. Remains from several of these graves carry a mixture of R1a subclades, with some showing distant affinities to steppe haplogroups like Z93. These burials are often located near major river systems or ancient trade routes, reinforcing the theory that these regions served as corridors of contact and exchange. Scholars suggest that small groups of Sarmatians or Alans may have entered Polish territories not as conquerors but as mercenaries, traders, or migrating clans that gradually merged with local elites. This would explain the limited but persistent genetic signals and the steppe-style grave goods without requiring large-scale migration. It also aligns with Roman sources from the first few centuries CE, which mention Sarmatian auxiliaries in the Roman military, some of whom settled in Central Europe after service. In one notable case, a richly furnished warrior grave from the vicinity of Przemysl included a 3-part belt set, gold rings, and a horse skeleton, all dated to the late 2nd century CE. The anthropological features of the skull were noted as atypical for local populations, and the burial lacked typical Slavic pottery. Genetic analysis later revealed a mixture of maternal lineages from the Caucasus and paternal markers linked to the steppe. Such evidence strengthens the case that some eastern lineages reached Poland during the late Iron Age, most likely through elite migration or intermarriage. However, these lineages were likely absorbed into local communities over time, with their cultural signatures fading but never fully vanishing. As the Slavic expansion intensified in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, many older traditions were replaced or blended into the emerging Slavic culture, including burial customs. Yet echoes of steppe influence remained, particularly in the martial symbols of the nobility. Long after the Sarmatians had vanished as a distinct group, Polish nobles continued to wear curved sabers, grow long mustaches, and bury themselves with ornate weaponry, all reminiscent of steppe warrior codes. These traditions were not accidental. They represented a conscious cultural identity tied to a myth of Eastern origins. In this way, the burial record becomes a mirror of the Sarmatian myth, not confirming every detail but revealing a layered truth beneath it. Cultural symbols, once embedded in burial practices, evolved into national legends. And while the average Polish peasant may never have carried steppe ancestry, the noble class continued to cultivate the image of Sarmatian descent through dress, behavior, and ceremony. In historical portraits of winged hussars, we see armor, feathers, and swords that echo both medieval chivalry and steppe nomadism. The burial record shows us how this aesthetic has deep archaeological roots. In some cases, even the use of horsehair in noble garments or wing attachments can be linked back to burial traditions of the Sarmatians and Alans. This long cultural memory speaks to the power of identity and how it is constructed across centuries, not only through genetics but through soil, bone, and belief. In the next chapter, we will move from graves to maps, examining how ancient geography and the shifting borders of empires shaped the movement of people and genes across the Polish landscape. We will explore how trade routes, migration paths, and imperial ambitions brought steppe ancestry into the heart of Europe and helped create the layered identity that defines Poland today. Stay with us as we trace the geography of origins and the forgotten roads of the neighboring nation strategy. Part 6. Forgotten Roads and Ancient Routes. To understand how steppe ancestry entered Polish soil and became embedded in noble identity, we must follow the forgotten roads that once stitched Eurasia together. Long before Poland existed as a unified kingdom, its territory served as a critical junction between the East and West, where goods, people, and ideas flowed along a vast network of trade and migration routes. Chief among these was the Amber Road, which connected the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic, carrying precious amber from northern Europe to Mediterranean civilizations. But this was only one artery in a larger system. East of the Vistula, the Sarmatian corridor stretched across the open plains, linking the Black Sea steppe to the heart of Central Europe. It was through these corridors that nomadic warriors, merchant caravans, and displaced populations entered Polish territory, leaving behind material traces and genetic footprints. Archaeological surveys in southeastern Poland have uncovered Roman-era artifacts, bronze figurines, coins, and amphora fragments, far from any Roman settlement. These objects indicate sustained contact between local tribes and distant empires, likely mediated by steppe intermediaries such as the Sarmatians, Alans, and later, Avars. These groups often served as both facilitators and disruptors of commerce, demanding tribute or acting as mercenaries in regional power struggles. Some would settle temporarily, marry into local elites, and then move on, spreading cultural practices and introducing new lineages along the way. Ancient roads were not just economic tools. They were vectors of ancestry. Recent geoarchaeological reconstructions show that major river valleys, the San, Bug, and Dniester, formed natural migration routes leading directly into Polish territory. These river corridors were used by steppe nomads to move their herds, by refugees fleeing conflicts, and by warrior bands looking for new lands to control. Genetic data supports these pathways. Regions adjacent to these ancient routes tend to show elevated levels of steppe-related haplogroups and autosomal markers, even when compared to more isolated areas within the same country. This reinforces the idea that geography influenced the genetic landscape, acting as both gatekeeper and gateway. The neighboring nation strategy, linking Polish identity to a noble Eastern origin, relied not just on myth but on real geographical logic. It was entirely plausible, even likely, that nobles living near these corridors would have inherited steppe genes or absorbed steppe customs. Over generations, these influences solidified into noble traditions, later interpreted as evidence of descent. This process can be seen in other regions as well. In the Balkans, for example, medieval elites often claimed Roman or Thracian ancestry to distinguish themselves from the rural population. In Hungary, the Arpad dynasty invoked links to the Huns and Magyars to legitimize their rule. Poland's Sarmatian myth fits this same pattern, a strategic use of migration history shaped by the geography of contact. Throughout the late Iron Age and Roman period, the territories of modern Poland remained on the periphery of empire yet central to Trans-Eurasian movement. While Rome never directly conquered Poland, its cultural influence reached Polish lands through intermediaries, many of whom were steppe nomads. The Sarmatians, for example, served in the Roman cavalry and were granted settlements in the provinces of Pannonia and Dacia, both within striking distance of the Carpathian Basin. From there, they could and did move northward. Roman historians noted that the Sarmatians had no fixed borders, often shifting their settlements based on pasture, politics, or alliance. This mobility allowed them to integrate into different regions while maintaining aspects of their warrior culture. In Polish folklore and noble memory, these mobile warriors were transformed into mythical ancestors who bestowed valor, freedom, and foreign distinction. But beneath the myth was a geography that made such movement not only possible but inevitable. Even in the early medieval period, when Slavic tribes began forming the core of what would become the Polish state, steppe influence persisted. The Avars launched raids deep into Central Europe, and their empire touched parts of southern Poland. The Khazars and Pecheneg maintained intermittent contact with Slavic principalities, sometimes through war, sometimes through diplomacy. The Magyars, themselves a steppe people, passed through Polish lands before settling in the Carpathian Basin around the 9th century. These interactions did not always leave written records, but they often left genetic residue. A recent study comparing Iron Age and early medieval genomes from Polish and Ukrainian burial sites found overlapping ancestry components, including small but detectable Central Asian segments. These were not dominant, but they were persistent, threads woven through centuries of exchange. Today, those threads appear in haplogroup anomalies, phenotypic variations, and cultural artifacts that defy simple categorization. They challenge the narrative of a pure Slavic past and instead reveal a dynamic frontier where geography shaped identity. The steppe was never a border. It was a bridge. And Poland, situated at the crossroads of Europe, absorbed travelers from every direction. In the next part, we'll investigate how the formation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth reinterpreted this legacy, elevating the Sarmatian myth into a full-blown national ideology and embedding it into the laws, literature, and aesthetics of a rising empire. Join us as we examine how ancient ancestry was transformed into statecraft and how a myth became policy in the heart of Eastern Europe. Part 7. Sarmatia Reborn. Myth becomes statecraft. By the time the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth emerged in the 16th century, the Sarmatian myth had evolved from a noble curiosity into a full-fledged ideological framework that shaped everything from fashion and literature to law and foreign policy. It was during this period that the neighboring nation strategy reached its most refined form, transforming claims of descent from steppe warriors into a cultural blueprint for the ruling class. The Commonwealth was a massive and diverse political entity, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, incorporating not just Poles and Lithuanians but also Ruthenians, Belarusians, and others. In such a multi-ethnic context, the nobility needed a unifying identity that could set them apart from the common masses while binding them together across linguistic and regional divides. Sarmatism offered the perfect solution. It declared the Slakta, or noble class, to be the direct descendants of Sarmatian warriors, men of honor, courage, and unbreakable independence. This identity was not just rhetorical. It was embedded in laws, heraldry, architecture, and literature. Nobles wrote political treatises invoking Sarmatian bloodlines to justify their privileges and liberties. They claimed that, like their ancestors, they owed allegiance to no king but their own assemblies and that personal freedom was the highest virtue. The myth gave political weight to the unique system of noble democracy known as the Golden Liberty, where elected kings ruled at the pleasure of the nobles and legislation required unanimous consent. This system, while chaotic, was hailed as the natural inheritance of a warrior race born to govern themselves. Visual culture reflected this ideology. Polish nobles adopted Eastern-style garments, long kaftans, fur-lined cloaks, curved sabers, and elaborate belts, not as exotic fashion but as symbols of their supposed steppe ancestry. These outfits bore striking resemblance to Sarmatian military dress described in Roman sources. Even court rituals began to incorporate references to steppe nomadism. Horsemanship was exalted, martial tournaments reenacted ancient battles, and family genealogies were traced back to fictional or legendary Sarmatian chieftains. The winged hussars, Poland's most iconic cavalry, were outfitted in armor and wings inspired not by Western knights but by imagined steppe heroes. Their feathered backs and curved sabers served as national symbols, reinforcing the idea that Poland's military prowess stemmed from its ancient Sarmatian core. Literature followed suit. Poets and playwrights glorified Sarmatian values, honor, loyalty, and martial skill, while framing historical events through the lens of ancestral heroism. These narratives were printed in political pamphlets and family chronicles, circulating among the elite as both entertainment and education. The Sarmatian myth became a feedback loop. The more it was invoked, the more it shaped elite behavior, and the more that behavior seemed to confirm the myth. But this ideology also had real consequences. It reinforced the gap between nobles and peasants, who were excluded from the Sarmatian legacy and treated as ethnically and culturally distinct. The Slakta viewed themselves not just as a higher social class but as a different people altogether. This created a rigid caste dynamic within the Commonwealth, where social mobility was limited and identity was defined by birthright and appearance. Foreign observers often remarked on how Polish nobles seemed to imitate Eastern customs while claiming ancient Western ancestry. This contradiction puzzled some, but to the nobles, it made perfect sense. They saw themselves as the bridge between civilizations, the inheritors of an ancient warrior tradition that stretched from Iran to the Vistula. The myth even influenced foreign policy. When negotiating with the Ottomans or the Crimean Khanate, Polish diplomats often referenced shared steppe ancestry to build rapport or assert cultural superiority. During conflicts with Russia or Sweden, Sarmatian imagery was used in propaganda to depict Polish warriors as the rightful defenders of liberty against tyranny. The narrative was so pervasive that even critics of noble excess framed their arguments in Sarmatian terms, accusing corrupt elites of betraying their warrior ancestors. Over time, this powerful ideology began to shape national memory, casting the Commonwealth as a unique civilization born of noble savagery and democratic tradition. Yet the historical and genetic evidence suggests a more nuanced reality. While some steppe ancestry did exist, especially among certain elite lineages, the majority of the Polish population remained rooted in West Slavic heritage. The Sarmatian myth had inflated a partial truth into a national foundation. But like all enduring myths, its power lay not in its accuracy but in its utility. It offered a proud, coherent, and heroic identity at a time when the Commonwealth was navigating religious wars, foreign invasions, and internal division. It gave the nobility a story to tell and a standard to uphold. Even after the Commonwealth collapsed in the late 18th century, the myth endured. Polish exiles invoked Sarmatism during uprisings and petitions, using it to rally support for national independence. Writers in the Romantic period romanticized the Sarmatian past as a golden age of honor and resistance. And today, echoes of this ideology remain in Polish national symbolism, military traditions, and even genetic discussions. In the next part, we will trace how modern DNA science interacts with this legacy, how personal ancestry testing, population studies, and haplogroup data are reshaping how Poles view their own past and how they understand the lasting influence of the neighboring nation strategy. Stay with us as we move from ideology to identity and examine what the science of the 21st century reveals about the myths of the 16th. Part 8. Genetics meets identity. Testing the Sarmatian legacy. In the 21st century, the widespread availability of direct-to-consumer genetic testing has allowed millions of individuals to investigate their ancestry, giving the public unprecedented access to information once confined to laboratories. In Poland, this wave of interest has sparked a renaissance in historical identity, especially among those curious about their connection to the legendary Sarmatians. With a simple saliva sample, people can now receive detailed reports outlining their haplogroups, autosomal admixture, and regional ancestry breakdowns. For many Poles, the results confirm what history and language already suggest: strong ties to West Slavic populations with dominant markers like haplogroup R1a-Z282. However, some receive unexpected results, including rare paternal lineages such as R1a-Z93 or even Q, J2, or G2, which are typically associated with ancient steppe or Near Eastern populations. These cases often ignite curiosity and speculation about possible Sarmatian or Alan ancestry, especially when combined with family traditions or noble surnames. DNA forums across Poland are filled with discussions about these findings, as users compare haplogroup trees, trace subclades, and share stories passed down through generations. While most haplogroups offer broad connections rather than precise biographies, their distributions provide critical context. For instance, R1a-Z93, while rare in Poland overall, shows localized presence in southeastern regions near historical trade routes and steppe corridors. This geographic clustering aligns with archaeological and historical evidence of contact between local populations and steppe groups during the Iron Age and Roman periods. Scientists working with Polish genome projects have noted that individuals with such steppe lineage markers often exhibit minor but measurable Central Asian or Caucasus autosomal components in their broader DNA profiles. These are not dominant traits but fragments, genetic echoes of past interactions that persist in a population primarily defined by its Slavic roots. These echoes validate key aspects of the Sarmatian myth, not as a widespread ethnic origin, but as a layered influence embedded within elite families and specific regions. In fact, some private Polish projects now seek to map noble lineages genetically, tracing connections between historic Slavic families and steppe origin haplogroups. Though controversial, such efforts reflect a public hunger to blend science with cultural memory. For many, discovering a rare haplogroup feels like uncovering a lost chapter in their family's story. The resurgence of this interest comes at a time when national narratives across Eastern Europe are being re-examined through the lens of population genetics. Governments, academic institutions, and private researchers collaborate on national genome databases, aiming to chart the deep structure of regional ancestry. Poland is no exception. Recent genome-wide association studies have placed modern Poles within a tight genetic cluster alongside Czechs, Slovaks, and Western Ukrainians, confirming strong West Slavic continuity. Yet within this cluster are subtle deviations, outliers whose DNA hints at deeper Eurasian connectivity. Experts caution against overinterpretation, noting that ancient gene flow does not confirm modern ethnic identity, but they acknowledge the value in exploring these historical layers. According to peer-reviewed studies, approximately 1 to 3% of modern Polish males carry lineages that can be linked, however distantly, to steppe nomads like the Sarmatians or Alans. Though small, this percentage is statistically significant and aligns with the historical theory that some steppe warriors integrated into local elites through marriage, military service, or migration. The cultural impact of such a legacy far exceeds the genetic percentage. Sarmatian symbolism helped shape Poland's political structure, fashion, and foreign diplomacy. Now, modern genetics provides a tool to revisit these narratives with scientific nuance. Online platforms like GEDmatch and YFull allow Polish users to explore deep subclades of their Y-DNA or mtDNA, sometimes discovering connections to ancient samples from archaeological digs in the North Caucasus or Ukrainian steppe. These matches do not confirm direct descent, but suggest shared ancestry thousands of years ago, reinforcing the idea that Polish identity is the result of long-standing regional interactions rather than isolated development. Meanwhile, educational institutions in Poland have begun incorporating genetic history into university curricula, blending biology with anthropology and history. Students now examine how haplogroups like R1a, I2, and E1b1b map onto historical migrations, from the corded ware culture to the Scythian Sarmatian horizon. Public awareness campaigns, supported by museums and cultural centers, highlight these findings to engage broader audiences. Some Polish museums now include genetic exhibits alongside historical artifacts, allowing visitors to explore both material culture and genetic heritage in a unified narrative. These exhibitions often emphasize the diversity within Polish DNA, countering outdated notions of ethnic purity and encouraging a broader understanding of national origins. In this context, the Sarmatian myth gains renewed relevance, not as a rigid origin story but as one thread in a larger tapestry of migration, adaptation, and identity construction. As one Polish geneticist put it, "We are not proving the Sarmatian myth. We are explaining why it made sense in the first place." The landscape of modern genetics does not replace history, it adds dimension. By analyzing how genes moved through ancient routes, settled in elite lineages, and shaped regional variations, we come closer to understanding why myths endure and how they resonate. In the next part, we will explore how Poland's regional diversity reflects these ancient patterns and why some areas retain more steppe influence than others. Stay with us as we map the DNA within the borders and unlock the hidden geography of Polish origins through the lens of the neighboring nation strategy. Part 9. The Regional Mosaic. Mapping Poland's Genetic Layers. When modern geneticists overlay haplogroup data and autosomal DNA on the map of Poland, what emerges is not a uniform portrait but a regional mosaic, a complex landscape shaped by ancient migrations, medieval settlements, trade routes, and political borders that shifted over centuries. While the dominant West Slavic marker R1a-Z282 stretches across the entire country, its density and subclade distribution vary significantly by region, offering clues to deeper ancestral dynamics. In Western Poland, particularly in Greater Poland and Silesia, genetic profiles align strongly with Czech and Slovak populations, reflecting long-standing historical ties through the Vistulans and Moravian enclaves. This area shows high homogeneity and low presence of steppe-related haplogroups like R1a-Z93 or G2, suggesting limited Eastern influence in ancient or early medieval times. However, as one moves eastward toward Lesser Poland, Subcarpathia, and the Podlaski region, the picture becomes more nuanced. Here, subtle traces of Central Asian and Caucasian ancestry appear in both Y-DNA and autosomal markers, small percentages, often below 3%, but statistically persistent across multiple studies. These traces are not random. They correlate with the ancient trade routes that once linked the Black Sea steppes to the Polish heartland via the San and Bug River corridors. These rivers were natural highways for merchants, warriors, and migrants from antiquity through the early Middle Ages. Settlements along these rivers often yielded archaeological remains bearing steppe-style weaponry, jewelry, and burial customs, now mirrored in the genomes of nearby descendants. In these southeastern zones, the occasional presence of R1a-Z93 or J2, especially among individuals claiming noble ancestry, becomes more than coincidence. It maps directly onto the areas of highest Sarmatian and Alan contact. Even further east, in border regions once governed by the Ruthenian voivodeships, the genetic profile shifts again. These territories, once shared with modern Ukraine and Belarus, show stronger signals of Eastern Slavic influence but also host rare steppe markers not seen in Western Poland. These findings align with medieval records indicating the presence of steppe-origin warriors in the service of Polish princes, particularly during conflicts with the Teutonic Knights and Mongol incursions. In northern Poland, especially in Warmia and Mazuria, the genetic data reflects a mixture of Slavic and Baltic lineages, with higher frequencies of haplogroups like N1C and I1, associated with Finno-Ugric and Scandinavian populations. Steppe influence here is minimal, supporting the idea that contact with nomadic groups was geographically bounded by natural and cultural frontiers. Meanwhile, in central Poland, home to the political centers of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the data tells yet another story. Although steppe lineages are rare overall, they are disproportionately represented in family lines associated with historical nobility, particularly those documented in heraldic records. A study by a Polish genealogical society in 2024 found that among self-identified members of noble descent, R1a-Z93 appeared nearly 5 times more often than in the general population, albeit still under 10%. This suggests a retention of steppe-origin DNA in elite bloodlines, consistent with the Sarmatian myth's narrative of an aristocracy descended from ancient warriors of the East. These regional variations matter because they reinforce the concept that Polish identity, while united by language and culture, is biologically layered. The neighboring nation strategy was never a blanket myth. It was a reflection of regional diversity shaped by geography and contact. The noble class, most exposed to foreign alliances, warfare, and political marriages, was naturally more likely to absorb non-local ancestry. The peasantry, by contrast, remained genetically stable and Slavic in their composition, contributing to the stark contrast between myth and mass identity. This regional genetic layering mirrors historical developments. The partitions of Poland, the shifting frontiers of the Commonwealth, and centuries of internal migration reshaped the genetic map without fully erasing older patterns. For instance, during the partitions, nobles from eastern regions often resettled in western Poland, carrying with them rare haplogroups that are now found outside their historical heartlands. Similarly, resettlements after World War II created demographic blends that occasionally obscure but never fully erase the underlying ancestral lines. Today, geneticists use these regional differences to reconstruct population history in Poland with increasing resolution. Using PCA plots, admixture graphs, and haplotype networks, researchers can identify microclusters of ancestry that correspond with ancient tribal zones, medieval trade centers, and even historical battlefields. These techniques are helping to map not just where people lived, but where their genes came from, how they moved, and with whom they mixed. Public interest in these maps is growing. DNA testing services in Poland now include regional breakdowns, allowing users to compare their results with localized reference populations. This has led to increased awareness of regional identity and a renewed appreciation for the complexity of Polish origins. Schools and museums across the country are beginning to include regional genetic heritage in their educational programs, showing how modern science enhances rather than replaces cultural history. In this context, the Sarmatian myth regains its depth, not as a universal truth, but as a geographically grounded story that carried different weight in different regions. In the next part of this series, we will explore how Poland's neighbors, Lithuania, Ukraine, Hungary, and Romania, shared or contested similar steppe-related myths, and how cross-border genetic links reveal a broader Eurasian story that transcends modern national boundaries. Stay with us as we extend the neighboring nation strategy beyond Poland's borders and reveal the interconnected web of identity that shaped Eastern Europe. Part 10. Beyond Poland. Steppe myths across Eastern Europe. While Poland's noble identity was uniquely shaped by the Sarmatian myth, it was not alone in constructing a national narrative rooted in steppe ancestry, and as we follow the genetic threads beyond Polish borders, we discover that neighboring nations developed their own versions of the neighboring nation strategy, often invoking shared or rival claims to steppe heritage. In Lithuania, the Grand Duchy's elite families also embraced a form of Eastern martial identity, especially during the union with Poland, when the Commonwealth's ruling class adopted Sarmatian customs collectively. Lithuanian nobles often participated in the same political and cultural rituals as Polish szlachta, wearing similar garments, using curved sabers, and tracing fictional lineages to nomadic chieftains. Though Lithuania's core population carried more Baltic haplogroups like N1c and R1a-Z280, some noble lineages, particularly in southern Lithuania and near the Belarusian border, exhibit minor but detectable steppe ancestry, suggesting historical interaction through intermarriage and shared military campaigns. Moving southeast to Ukraine, the Sarmatian footprint becomes more explicit. The Pontic steppe, encompassing southern Ukraine, was the historical homeland of the Sarmatians, Scythians, and Alans. Ukrainian archaeological sites are rich with kugons, burial mounds containing weapons, horse remains, and other artifacts linked to nomadic warrior culture. Modern genetic studies show that Ukrainians, especially in the south and east, have slightly elevated levels of steppe ancestry compared to Central or Western Poles. Haplogroups such as R1a-Z93 and Q1b appear more frequently here, and autosomal analysis reveals traces of Central Asian admixture likely tied to successive waves of migration from the steppe. Ukrainian Cossacks, a semi-nomadic military class that emerged in the 15th century, often appropriated Sarmatian imagery to describe their free, warrior-based society. Cossack dress, lifestyle, and even self-governance were framed in historical accounts as echoes of Sarmatian tradition, though the actual genetic continuity remains complex. In Hungary, the narrative shifts again but retains a steppe core. The Hungarian people trace their foundational myth to the arrival of the Magyars, a Finno-Ugric-speaking group from the Ural Mountains who settled in the Carpathian Basin around the 9th century. The Arpad dynasty, Hungary's founding royal family, claimed descent from Attila the Hun, linking themselves to steppe nomads through legend rather than language. Genetic studies of Hungarian males reveal a diverse mix of haplogroups, including R1a-Z93 and N1c, the latter more common among Uralic populations. While steppe ancestry is not dominant, it is more prevalent among individuals claiming noble heritage, especially in Transdanubia and regions bordering modern-day Romania. The legacy of the Huns, Avars, and Cumans, successive nomadic invaders, has left genetic and cultural marks across Hungary, particularly in place names, folklore, and family traditions. In Romania, steppe ancestry is layered atop a different cultural foundation. While Romanians trace their national origins to Dacians and Romans, they too have absorbed influences from Sarmatians, Scythians, Alans, and later steppe groups. In particular, the Sarmatians settled parts of Wallachia and Moldavia, and Roman-era inscriptions confirm their military integration under Roman rule. Modern Romanian DNA reflects this mixture. While E1b, 1b and I2 are common Balkan lineages, R1a, especially subclades linked to the steppe, appears in notable frequencies in eastern regions. Historical records describe noble families in Moldavia claiming descent from steppe warriors, and cultural practices like horsemanship, tribal banners, and cavalry traditions preserve the echoes of that ancestry. Romania's own Dacian continuity myth, long debated among historians, has occasionally intersected with the steppe narrative, especially in nationalist contexts that elevate warrior origins. Across these regions, what emerges is not a single origin myth but a shared strategy, linking nobility, independence, and martial virtue to steppe ancestry. These myths differed in detail but shared the same goal: to distinguish the elite from the masses and frame national identity as ancient, noble, and hardened by the winds of the steppe. Genetically, these claims are partially supported, especially in noble lineages and regions along historical migration routes, but they rarely represent the broader population. This reveals a fascinating dynamic, where identity is formed not by the majority's DNA but by the minority's story. It also reflects how myth can transcend borders. The Sarmatians, once a scattered confederation of nomadic tribes, became symbolic ancestors in multiple countries, each adapting the legend to fit their political and cultural context. Today, genetic studies are helping to sort these narratives into historical timelines, identifying which legends reflect real ancestral mixing and which are cultural projections layered over time. Yet none of these myths can be entirely dismissed. They contain kernels of truth, moments of contact, paths of migration, unions of families, that left behind both DNA and memory. As we connect Poland's genetic landscape to its neighbors, we see that the neighboring nation strategy was not an isolated invention but part of a broader East European pattern of elite self-fashioning. In the next part, we will explore how these myths and genetic findings have influenced modern political identity, national narratives, and debates over heritage in Poland and beyond. Stay with us as we examine how science reshapes the meaning of ancestry in the 21st century. Part 11: Heritage Wars, Politics, Identity, and the Sarmatian Debate. As genetic research continues to uncover the complexity of Polish and Eastern European origins, it increasingly intersects with modern politics, national identity, and cultural memory in ways both empowering and contentious. In Poland, the revitalized interest in the Sarmatian legacy has stirred debate across academic, political, and public spheres, reigniting questions about what it means to be Polish, who gets to define national ancestry, and how scientific evidence is used or misused in the construction of historical identity. At the center of this debate is the dual legacy of the Sarmatian myth. On one hand, a noble tradition celebrated in literature, heraldry, and historical reenactments. On the other, a divisive narrative that historically excluded the peasantry and reinforced rigid class distinctions. In the 20th century, particularly during communist rule, the myth was largely suppressed or mocked as elitist and unscientific, a relic of the Slakters' imagined superiority. However, in the post-communist era, interest in the noble past has returned, fueled in part by access to personal DNA testing, digitized genealogies, and a renewed emphasis on regional pride. Public discourse now includes televised documentaries, online genealogy forums, and political speeches that reference the Sarmatian tradition either with admiration or skepticism. Right-leaning political groups have sometimes embraced the myth as part of a broader effort to reclaim Poland's historical greatness, emphasizing themes of independence, martial valor, and cultural uniqueness. They argue that reconnecting with noble traditions can inspire patriotism and national cohesion, especially among younger generations seeking historical continuity. In this narrative, the Sarmatian past becomes symbolic of Poland's defiance against foreign domination, whether by petitioning empires, Nazi occupiers, or communist regimes. However, critics warn that this romanticized view oversimplifies history and risks turning a complex genetic and cultural legacy into an exclusionary myth. They point out that the vast majority of Poles are descended from Slavic-speaking agrarian communities, not warrior elites, and that the noble class, while influential, represented only a small fraction of the population. Moreover, some fear that using genetic data to validate or invalidate cultural identity could lead to new forms of biological nationalism, where haplogroups are misused to draw lines between real and less real Poles. Scientists caution that genetics is about probabilities, not absolutes, and that ancestry is a spectrum, not a stamp. A single haplogroup does not define a person's culture, loyalty, or worth. Nevertheless, the idea that one's DNA might confirm descent from ancient steppe warriors remains deeply attractive to many. This is particularly visible in online communities, where users eagerly post Y-DNA results, debate subclades like R1a-Z93 versus Z282, and interpret ancient maps through the lens of their test results. Some engage in respectful historical analysis, while others fall into pseudo-scientific speculation. This tension has prompted universities and genetic labs in Poland to launch educational campaigns, emphasizing the difference between population-level trends and personal ancestry. Workshops, museum exhibits, and public lectures now aim to explain how genetic markers are inherited, what they reveal about ancient migrations, and how they complement, not replace, archaeology, linguistics, and documented history. In schools, new history curricula are beginning to integrate genetic findings with traditional lessons, helping students understand that national identity is both cultural and biological, shaped by waves of interaction across millennia. Meanwhile, the Polish diaspora, particularly in the USA and Canada, has shown a strong interest in the Sarmatian narrative. For second- and third-generation immigrants, DNA testing offers a tangible connection to ancestral lands and a source of pride rooted in heroic imagery. Genealogy websites now offer Sarmatian-themed heritage packages, complete with coat of arms prints and steppe-inspired visuals, feeding a market eager for meaningful identity stories. Yet even here, the debate continues. Should the Sarmatian myth be embraced as cultural symbolism or critiqued as historical distortion? Can genetics clarify the truth, or does it merely provide new tools for reshaping old stories? These questions lie at the heart of contemporary heritage politics, where science, history, and myth collide. The Sarmatian debate mirrors broader global discussions about identity in the genetic age, how nations reinterpret the past through the lens of ancestry tests, and how personal data becomes entangled with collective memory. In Poland's case, the Sarmatian story remains compelling because it speaks to both aspiration and anxiety. It offers a narrative of nobility, strength, and uniqueness, yet also reminds us of the fragility of historical narratives built on selective memory. Today, as Poles navigate a complex world of EU integration, geopolitical tensions, and cultural globalization, the appeal of a proud and distinct origin grows stronger. But so does the need for nuance. The truth is that Poland's genetic and historical story is neither purely Slavic nor fully steppe-born. It is a mosaic formed at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, influenced by neighbors, shaped by migrations, and sustained by stories. In the next chapter, we will return to the science, diving deeper into how ancient DNA from Iron Age cemeteries across Eastern Europe continues to reveal unexpected connections, testing the boundaries of the neighboring nation strategy and uncovering new dimensions of ancestry that challenge long-held assumptions. Stay with us as we journey from modern myths to prehistoric graves and let the bones speak for themselves. Part 13. Bloodlines and Belonging. What it means to be Polish today. As our journey through the layers of myth, migration, and genetics draws to a close, one question remains. What does all of this mean for modern Polish identity? And how should people today engage with the legacy of the neighboring nation strategy in light of what science now reveals? The answer, like Poland's ancestry, is complex. For centuries, the myth of Sarmatian descent served a purpose. It gave the noble class a sense of uniqueness, a reason to claim privileges, and a story that differentiated them from the rural majority. That myth was never meant to be a full account of national history. It was a cultural construct, rooted in fragments of truth, magnified by politics, and immortalized in dress, law, and ritual. But now, with the advent of genetic testing, population sequencing, and ancient DNA comparisons, individuals and entire nations are confronting the reality that identity is not carved in stone but forged over time by waves of interaction, adaptation, and survival. In modern Poland, the overwhelming majority of the population belongs to West Slavic genetic clusters, especially those defined by R1a-Z282 and its descendant branches. This reflects a powerful continuity, a story of settlement and persistence through invasions, partitions, and modern state building. Yet within this Slavic core lie subtle genetic whispers from the steppe, the Caucasus, and beyond. Rare paternal lineages, autosomal signals, and mitochondrial variants that remind us of earlier eras when warriors rode in from the east, married into local elites, and passed on not just weapons or customs but fragments of their genome. Today, these fragments may only appear in a few percent of the population, often concentrated among families with historical ties to noble status or borderland regions. But their presence confirms that the Sarmatian myth, while exaggerated, was not entirely imagined. It emerged from observable differences, linguistic, cultural, physical, that, over centuries, were elevated into a national narrative. What genetics does now is not to replace that narrative, but to ground it, clarify it, and place it within a larger story. It shows that Poland's history cannot be told as a single stream but as a braided river. Slavic roots forming the main channel, with Sarmatian, Baltic, Germanic, and even Uralic tributaries flowing into it at different times. This view of ancestry is not just scientifically accurate, it is deeply human. Every nation carries within it the traces of neighbors, rivals, migrants, and those who stayed. Every people is shaped by contact, by fusion, by the messy and beautiful reality of human movement. In this light, the neighboring nation strategy becomes a mirror of our shared past rather than a tool of division. Rather than ask, are we Slavic or Sarmatian? The better question becomes, how did both shape who we are? And the answer is, culturally through myth, politically through noble identity, and biologically through centuries of occasional but meaningful mixing. For many modern Poles, this realization can be liberating. It frees national identity from rigid categories and opens it to a more inclusive, layered understanding. Whether one's haplogroup is R1a-Z282 or R1a-Z93, whether one descends from medieval peasants or Slakter elites, the shared experience of language, land, history, and survival binds the nation together more deeply than any single genetic marker. In classrooms, these findings can enrich historical education, offering students a view of their country that is dynamic, evidence-based, and global in its connections. In museums and media, the integration of genetics with archaeology, literature, and art can spark new interest in forgotten chapters of the past. And for families tracing their roots, the discovery of steppe ancestry should not be a test of nobility, but an invitation to explore how personal histories fit into broader continental movements. Science alone cannot tell us who we are, but it can help us understand how we came to be. In the case of Poland, ancient DNA has confirmed a strong and proud Slavic heritage while also identifying traces of Sarmatian legacy, especially in regions shaped by borderlands, battlefields, and cultural crossroads. This fusion does not dilute national identity. It enriches it. Just as the Commonwealth once spanned vast and diverse territories, so too does the Polish genome reflect a history of openness, resilience, and complexity. In our era of rising nationalism, politicized identity, and cultural anxiety, embracing this complexity may be the greatest strength a nation can possess. To be Polish today is to inherit not only the legacy of Piast kings and winged hussars, but also the deeper, older stories written in bones, buried in mounds, and now illuminated by science. The myth of the Sarmatian origin, once a shield of the nobility, now becomes a bridge, connecting the modern Polish people to the broader history of Eurasia, and to a time when boundaries were not walls but paths of movement and exchange. As the final takeaway of this series, we leave you with this thought: identity is not found in purity, but in presence. In what survives, in what endures, in what we choose to remember. So whether your ancestors rode from the steppe or tilled the soil of Mazovia, their stories are now one. And together, they form the full, living truth of Polish origins. Thank you for joining us on this journey through myth, DNA, and history, where the past speaks through blood and the future listens. Part 12: Voices from the Iron Age. What ancient DNA is now revealing. While modern DNA tests have sparked interest in individual ancestry and national narratives, it is the rise of ancient DNA analysis from Iron Age cemeteries across Eastern Europe that is now providing the most concrete data to challenge, confirm, or complicate the neighboring nation strategy. Over the last decade, teams of geneticists, archaeologists, and bioinformaticians have collaborated to extract and sequence the genomes of individuals buried between 1000 BCE and 500 CE across the Eurasian steppe and the lands that would become Poland. These ancient samples, often preserved in tooth enamel or petrous bones, allow scientists to reconstruct the genomes of long-dead populations and directly compare them with those of modern humans. From Sarmatian burial mounds in the Don-Volga region to mixed graves along the Carpathian Arc and the Vistula Basin, a clear pattern has emerged. The genetic landscape of the steppe during the Iron Age was far more mixed than previously thought. Sarmatian individuals carried not only R1a-Z93, the haplogroup associated with steppe nomads stretching into Central and South Asia, but also minor frequencies of lineages such as J2, Q1b, and even E1b1b, markers linked to the Caucasus, the Iranian Plateau, and the Balkans. This genetic diversity challenges older views of the Sarmatians as a homogeneous Iranic-speaking group and instead presents them as a dynamic, mobile confederation of warrior clans, absorbing people and customs across wide distances. In contrast, Iron Age individuals from central Poland, especially from cultures like the Przeworsk and Wielbark, show strong continuity with later Slavic populations, bearing high frequencies of R1a-Z282 and its downstream subclades like M458 and CTS1211. Yet even within these cemeteries, a small number of individuals stand out, carrying unusual paternal haplogroups and exhibiting elevated genetic distances from their contemporaries. These outliers often come from elite burials, graves with weapons, horse gear, imported goods, and signs of wealth. One particularly revealing case came from a grave in southeastern Poland dated to the 2nd century CE, where the individual carried R1a-Z93 and showed clear autosomal links to steppe populations south of the Caucasus. Accompanying this DNA were grave goods identical to those found in Sarmatian sites along the Lower Don. This find provided rare physical and genetic evidence of elite steppe individuals living or integrating within local Iron Age societies in Poland. Similar cases have been found near Krakow, Lublin, and even in Silesia, regions previously considered culturally isolated from the steppe world. Experts suggest that these were not mass migrations but targeted infiltrations. Individual warriors, chieftains, or emissaries who arrived through trade, conflict, or alliance and left a faint but traceable legacy in the region's genetic makeup. Another study of remains from the Biała Podlaska area found a woman buried with mixed Slavic and Sarmatian material culture, who carried mitochondrial DNA linked to ancient Iranian groups. Though her maternal line does not indicate mass migration, it confirms that intermarriage or movement between the steppe and Polish territories occurred on a human scale. These rare cases help explain why some modern Poles carry haplogroups like R1a-Z93 despite overwhelmingly Slavic autosomal profiles. It also explains how the noble Sarmatian myth may have grown from occasional truths, select families with unusual ancestry or customs that eventually became models for a wider aristocratic identity. Meanwhile, ancient DNA from the Ukrainian steppe and the North Caucasus is revealing new layers of migration previously invisible to historians. For example, early Alan populations, genetically similar to later Sarmatians, show consistent mixing with Caucasian populations, forming a unique blend that later spread into Romania, Moldova, and southeastern Poland. Some of these individuals even share genetic traits with Iron Age samples from Kazakhstan, suggesting that steppe ancestry was not limited to one wave or people, but was part of a centuries-long process of interaction and transformation. These revelations push the neighboring nation concept into deeper time, showing that identity, especially elite identity, was always porous, mobile, and multi-layered. DNA alone cannot tell us what language these people spoke or what myths they believed, but it shows who their ancestors were, how far they traveled, and where they left their mark. For Poland, this means the Sarmatian legacy is not a myth to be dismissed nor a truth to be blindly accepted. It is a genetic whisper from the Iron Age, one that aligns with specific burials, artifacts, and lineages rather than the population as a whole. As more ancient genomes are added to public databases, the picture will sharpen, but already the message is clear. Poland's noble roots, while largely Slavic, contain real threads of steppe ancestry, and these threads can be traced to specific individuals whose bones now speak across millennia. In the next and final part of our documentary, we will return to the present and ask, what does this all mean for modern Poles? How should genetic truth influence national identity? And what lessons can be learned when history, myth, and science finally meet? Join us as we conclude our journey through the ancestral layers of the neighboring nation strategy.
Genetics reshaped our view of Polish identity. The Sarmatian myth was based on fragments of truth. Elite lineages preserved warrior ancestry from the steppe. Most Poles remain genetically Slavic, but noble traditions had foreign roots. History, myth, and science now align. Ancient DNA shows a layered national story. What was once legend is now testable. Each haplogroup reveals migration, power, and memory. Subscribe for more DNA-based history documentaries. Watch the full series. Comment your haplogroup below.